Hello, this is Module 4, Assessing Language Skills, focusing on assessing 4 skills: listening, reading, writing, and speaking, including principles, considerations, and tasks or methods to assess such skills. Mini Lecture 1, Assessing Receptive Skills. I'd like to give you a heads up on the 3 main parts of the lecture: basic knowledge about assessing receptive skills, and how to assess reading and listening. Let's take a look at the quote on the screen. The basic problem is that the exercise of receptive skills does not necessarily or usually manifest itself directly in overt behavior. How far do you agree or disagree with the statement? As you can see from the quote, there is certain setbacks in assessing receptive skills. Specifically, there are 3 main challenges. Number 1. Set starts that cause candidates to exercise reading or listening skills and also result in behavior that demonstrates their use. Number 2. Specifying what is to be assessed is not straightforward because it is not completely clear exactly what the skills are that are involved in reading and listening. And number 3. Even if we do believe in the existence of certain some skills, it's difficult to know if an item has measured it. Now, we'll move on finding out about assessing reading skills. First of all, what is reading? What must one be able to do to read? Are there different types of reading? Also, please think back to a reading test you've taken. What was it measuring? Hughes divides reading skills into 2 big categories, which he calls expeditious reading operations and careful reading operations. Expeditious reading operations involves 3 main skills: skimming, search reading, and scanning. One important note that you should keep in mind is that any serious testing of expeditious reading must contain time pressure. Regarding careful reading operations, you can see on the screen a list of skills involved, like identify pronominal preference, identify discourse markers, interpret complex sentences, so on and so forth. However, some take issue with lists of skills like this as ill-defined and overlapping in Addison 2000. There are several reasons for assessing reading and the skills and knowledge that are involved in reading. The table lists these reasons and their applications. One strikingly new feature of assessment is motivating. A very common use of informal assessment is to make learners study. At the worst, they study because there will be a test. But preferably, success in the test maintains their interest in study. Regular comprehension tests can do this, but there are other ways as well which do not involve formal testing. Primarily, speed reading graphs. When learners do a regular speed reading course, they keep a graph of their speed and a graph of their comprehension, and for each passage they read, the results are entered on the graphs. This can be highly motivating for learners, particularly if their speed can be seen to increase and their comprehension remains steady. Next, reading logs. A log is a regular record of work done. When learners do extensive reading, they can keep a log noting the title, level, degree of enjoyment, and time taken to read for each graded reader or other book they read. Finally, oral book reports. Oral book reports involve learners talking to the class or a group of learners about a book they have just read. The goal of the report should not be to describe the book in detail, but to make others interested in reading it without giving away the ending or exciting parts. The use of assessment as a motivator has the aim of getting the learners to read, so that eventually they will not need assessment to motivate them. Moving on now to assessing listening. I'm going to describe some listening test procedures. Initially, dictation. The teacher reads aloud a text of approximately 150 words, phrase by phrase. The learners write each phrase as they hear it. This kind of test has been used as a test of general language proficiency. Quite similar is partial dictation. The learners have an incomplete written text in front of them. As they listen to a spoken version of the text, they fill in the missing parts on the written text. Most commonly used method of all is text with questions. The learners have a list of multiple choice questions in front of them while they listen to a text being read or a recorded dialogue. As they listen, they answer the questions. Responding to statements. The learners listen to statements or questions and respond to them by choosing from multiple choice items of words or pictures, by indicating true or false, or by giving a short answer. 3-choice true-false. Instead of responding to statements with just true or false, 3 categories of response are allowed: true-false opinion, or true-false not stated. Recorded close. The learners listen to a tape recording where every 15th word has been replaced by a beep sound and with pauses at the end of each sentence. As they listen to learners write the missing words. Information transfer. The learners listen to a description or dialogue and label a diagram or fill in a chart or table while they listen. Palmer describes a wide range of possibilities for information transfer. Rating scales and lists. Based on learners' performance on a task or based on teachers' knowledge of their learners, teachers indicate on a scale where they consider their learners are in terms of listening proficiency.
Hello. In language teaching, we often divide the skills into receptive and productive. And today the focus is on testing the receptive skills, which means that today you will find out more about testing and assessment options for listening and reading. And we'll be doing this together with Dr. Peter Gu from Victoria University of Wellington.
Okay, so today, Peter, we're going to be talking about the testing of receptive skills, the skills of listening and reading. Now, this is a huge topic, and we're not going to be able to go into any real depth. I thought it would be useful to start by just giving an outline of the nature of the receptive process. What goes on in a learner's head?
Sure. When we're talking about receptive language, we're talking about basically listening and reading. So for both listening and reading, actually we're talking about 3 main sources of variance that determines somebody's ability in listening and reading. So first of all, we have the readers and listeners. So the person is approaching, for example, a piece of text in reading and listening to a piece of text read aloud, for example, in listening. So the person will bring certain variations, and that determines how well he or she, in terms of language skill, in terms of personality even, will influence the listening, will influence the reading. And the text itself will also influence the results of listening and reading. For example, how difficult it is, what words are included, the topic of the text. So, in addition to these 2 types of variables, the person variables and the text variables, we're also talking about how skillful the listener or the reader is. So the person variables will determine, we're talking about who is doing the listening and reading. The text variables will answer the question of basically what can be read, what information is available in the text, whereas the process variable, what you do to the text, will determine how you process the text.
Okay, so clearly just there you've got three important variables at play. So to check my understanding, we've got the text, the task, and the individual, basically.
In the individual, the task, and the test, and the task of processing.
Okay, great. And so let's focus on listening, because we probably can't cover both listening and reading, and there are similarities between the two. So let's break it down a little bit. So when we think about the text, what are some of the considerations that you need to take into, take account of when you're designing assessment or a test?
First of all, the topic of the test, the text should be very important, because if it's something totally out of the listener's topical knowledge, then of course, no matter how easy the text itself is, at the sentence level, he or she won't be able to fully understand it. So the topic is definitely the first important thing, probably, in choosing a piece of text for listening. And next, I would say, it's where do you choose the text from, and how do you make up the text? For example, is it a piece of text read aloud on the spot by the teacher, or is it pre-recorded? So these will be the decisions you will have to make before you.
And so those ones you've just mentioned about reading aloud, pre-recorded, they're about the presentation of the input.
Sure.
So we've got decisions about the text, where the text is, the vocab level, the content of it. Then we've got the presentation of the input. And then we've got the response format, haven't we? How they're going to respond to it.
Sure. In terms of input, when we're listening, in terms of listening, one thing that you first think of probably will be the speaker's accent. And for example, does the listening test include various accents? Is it an American accent, or Kiwi accent, or British accent, or it doesn't really matter? It definitely matters in terms of, it depends on the purpose. The purpose of the listening test is to see somebody's listening ability in New Zealand. It has to be Kiwi accent, for example. The speed of the listening, the speed of the speaking, the person speaking, it definitely will influence the listening result as well. So these are the things in terms of the things you need to consider in terms of the input. Of course, in terms of after you provide the input, the listening test will also include the kind of responses you're eliciting from the learners. In terms of responses, you need to consider a number of things when you're designing the test. Do you want your listeners to, for example, simply respond verbally or non-verbally for very simple level, initial level of listening, probably for kids? You want to give them commands, for example, and they can bring you the book and open the door. So these are non-verbal kind of responses you're eliciting from the listeners. And sometimes you want to give students choices when they respond to your listening test. So do you ask them to read a number of responses and choose, for example, the most common type of response will be multiple choice, given 4 choices, and then only one of the choices is correct, but the choices are read first. So you're not, in that sense, testing only speaking, you're testing the speaker's ability in terms of reading those responses as well.
So it seems to me from what you're describing here is you're talking about validity issues. So if you're talking about testing listening and you're showing your understanding of listening by reading, does this cause problems?
It does. When you depends on your claims. If you claim this is only on listening, then it is a validity issue because you're talking about other things irrelevant to listening being involved. However, when you're talking about validity, you're talking about authenticity of the task itself. It's a matter of how real in language performance, in real language use, we have to separate listening from anything else. In real language use, mostly it's complex. It's not just one particular skill being involved. A lot of times, listening, one other skill we haven't talked about so far that is most commonly involved in listening is speaking. So we're talking about listening tests should not only involve one-way listening, which is listening to something and then responding to it, but also two-way listening. Actually, two-way listening tasks are probably more often seen than one-way listening tasks. By two-way listening tasks, I mean real kind of situations in listening where there are two parties, listeners and speakers.
Like us.
Exactly. We're exchanging information. As we listen, we're taking in the information, processing the information, and then responding appropriately. And that's a skill. That's a listening skill in terms of responding appropriately, not just being able to understand the information.
Well, I hope the viewers of this film give me full marks for my listening skills. It sounds like this is a very, very complex subject.
Sure.
Yeah, and a great deal to think about when you are designing a listening test.
Sure. There are a lot of details that you have to consider. It's definitely not that simple.
And I think that probably is the takeaway message, that when we are testing receptive skills, listening or reading, there are many, many variables to think about to design an appropriate test for your learners. So good luck. Thank you.
Finally, let's move on to the takeaway questions covering main points delivered in this lecture. First, what are the challenges in assessing perceptive skills? Second, what are two reading operations? Third, what are main goals of assessing reading and what methods to fulfill such goals? And last but not least, what are main goals of assessing listening and what methods to fulfill such goals? That is the end of mini lecture 1. We'll see each other again in the next lectures about assessing productive skills, namely speaking and writing.